Thank you so much for the warm welcome. As Olivia just said, my name is Lydia Murphy and I work for the Poverty Alliance on our Rights in Action project. All of our work at the Poverty Alliance is underpinned by the ethos and the understanding that poverty represents a breach of our economic, social and cultural rights. So we all have economic, social and cultural rights, and they're outlined in several key international legal instruments. But the one that we're predominantly going to be talking about today is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, one of the key pieces of international law that makes up the International Bill of Rights. So our economic, social and cultural rights include things like workers' rights, so the right to work, the right to just and favourable conditions of work, including fair pay, good working conditions, the right to take part in cultural life and to benefit from scientific advancement, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And this doesn't mean that all of us are going to be healthy. There are lots of factors that kind of feed into that. But what it does mean is that we should all be able to access healthcare services that are accessible, that are affordable, and that are of a good quality. The right to social security that allows us to realise our right to an adequate standard of living, our right to food, clothing, and housing, to the protection of family and the children. So kind of social care and freedom from forced marriage, and the right to education. So these are a whole host of kind of the key things that we need to live a dignified life. And they are our international human rights that are enshrined in international law. So one of the reasons why we're going to be talking about budgeting today is it's really clear that these rights have a big resource requirement behind them. And I think in Scotland, we often see progressive policy and great laws, and then we often see an implementation gap. And so you can have the best laws and policies, but if you don't have a budget that adequately resources them, we're not going to see rights realisation. So when the UK signed up to this treaty, they made a commitment to be taking concrete and targeted steps to make sure that we can access all of these human rights in their fullest form. And that while our governments and Scottish Government after devolution take these concrete and targeted steps, a minimum level of each of these human rights needs to be protected. So the human rights context in Scotland has been changing, and we've been talking a lot more about human rights in recent years. And the kind of most recent development has been a commitment to the Human Rights Bill for Scotland that has been committed to by our previous two First Ministers, but we're waiting on John Swinney to come out with his strong support for it. But this bill would incorporate key international human rights treaties into Scots law and would include the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that I've just spoken about, which now on I'm going to refer to by the catchy acronym ISESCA, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the right to a healthy environment, which is the newest human right. So proposals for this bill would mean that human rights needed to initially be built into the fabric of decision-making of all public bodies and private actors with public duties. And then after a period of time, there would then be a duty to comply, a legal duty to deliver on the terms of the treaties. So in regards to ISESCA, it would be around delivering the minimum essential level of each human right that's required for dignity. And this is called the minimum core in international law for everybody, and demonstrate that they are taking concrete and targeted steps to progressively realise the rights in the treaty to make sure that we are always moving towards full rights realisation in Scotland. There are some key principles that impact on human rights-based budgeting. So the idea of progressive realisation, that we're always moving forwards in terms of rights realisation, non-retrogression, that we're not taking steps backwards due to actions taken by public bodies, and that idea of that minimum core obligation, the minimum level of each human right that is required for dignity. And what's proposed in the Scottish Human Rights Bill is that this minimum core obligation would be kind of fleshed out by a participatory process. So why are we talking about budgets? So the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights said that it is now widely recognised that a government's budget is the most important economic policy and planning document, and it is an essential means by which to assess government's efforts for the realisation of human rights. So at the moment, Scottish Government doesn't budget with human rights in mind. It doesn't utilise human rights-based budgeting, and proposals for the new Human Rights Bill have said that they will add human rights principles into existing processes. But the Scottish Human Rights Commission has suggested that in order to kind of make sure that we're having the human rights outcomes that we deserve in Scotland, that there needs to be kind of reconsideration of what the budgetary process looks like. So what does ISESCA say about resources? Actually, I'm going to reverse one step. And I've mentioned about human rights-based budgeting, but I have not told you what it is. So human rights-based budgeting means that right standards shape the goals of the budget, and that human rights principles shape the process of budgeting in all phases. But it's important to note that before the development of the budget comes development of laws, of policies, of plans that should also be shaped by human rights standards, and that the budget should be created directly to kind of realise these. And so if we're looking at human rights-based budgeting on an organisational level, it would mean that we'd thought about human rights and the development of kind of policies, processes, programmes, and then a budget to adequately resource those. So ISESCA outlines our key economic, social and cultural rights, but it also has some things to say about resources and the way that we use resources. So this is very wordy, but Article 2.1 states that states should take steps to the maximum of their available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realisation of the rights recognised in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. So that is a mouthful. But in this like little paragraph, there are some really key principles that underpin human rights budgeting. And the first of these is the idea of maximum available resources. So what does maximum available resources mean? So resources in this context are not just financial, but they're also human, natural, technological, but it's also not just about the kind of resource pie as currently exists. It's kind of looking at how we can expand that, how we can generate more resources to put towards rights realisation in Scotland. Because the idea of non-discrimination runs through all things human rights, and I know that some of you guys have done a session on the panel principles, so you'll recognise that from there. Efforts to generate additional resources need to be equitable, and they need to be in line with that principle of non-discrimination. So they need to not disproportionately target groups. There's so no kind of progressive taxation. And they also need to be adequate. So we need to be making sure that we're doing enough to resource rights realisation in Scotland. So resources must be spent efficiently. And this is efficient from a human rights perspective rather than a kind of classical economic perspective. So efficient as in that they ensure maximum human rights outcomes and prioritise those who are furthest from their rights. And there also needs to not be underspend. And so in this small section, Article 2.1 that we've just spoken about, there are some other key principles that I'm going to talk about that should shape the content of the budget. So we've spoken about maximum available resources, so that a state is putting the maximum of its available resources towards rights realisation for all. While they're doing this, they need to make sure that they're protecting minimum essential level of each right for everybody. So this means that the programmes and services that support people to access these must be adequately resourced to make sure that everyone is able to access this minimum level of each human right. So particular care needs to be taken to ensure that those who are furthest from their rights are not left out. So when we think about this in regard to budgeting, we're kind of asking the questions, is sufficient revenue generated to invest in realising a basic level of right for everybody? do budget allocations prioritise the achievement of minimum core obligations? So in Scotland, concerns have been raised by the Human Rights Commission that we're not currently meeting our minimum core obligations in regard to housing and in regard to food, which makes kind of cuts to the housing budget even more concerning, and particularly as minimum core obligations are for all nations across the world. So another key principle that I've spoken about already today is the idea of progressive realisation, that states must move efficiently and as expeditiously as possible towards full realisation of our economic, social and cultural rights, and budget in a way that supports this. So progressive realisation and evidence of this could take different forms. So it could be increasing funding to programmes that enable rights realisation, introducing new programmes, reducing restrictions or expanding access to certain entitlements or programmes. There's no really one way of measuring whether economic, social and cultural rights have been progressively realised. So there's an element of subjectivity in this. But in a budget context, it's about asking, do budget decisions demonstrate a commitment to realising rights over time? Is expenditure on rights realisation increasing or decreasing? And does the government expect outcomes to improve given the resources allocated to realising human rights? And could the government increase revenue available to support rights realisation? And also importantly, is this measured? So progressive realisation's partner is non-retrogression, which means not taking steps that deprive people of rights that they previously enjoyed. And this is even in times of kind of budget constraints. And if budget decisions directly deprive people of their enjoyment of a right, it must be justified as essential, proportionate, and temporary, and kind of all other avenues need to have been explored previously. And then something that should run through the kind of content of the budget and also the process of budget development in human rights-based budgeting is the idea of non-discrimination. So there needs to be a kind of assessment on the impact of the budget on different groups. And if this is to be in line with the process principle of kind of transparency that we'll talk about in a minute, then that should also be published. And people whose rights are most at risk should be involved in kind of decisions that are being made. So those are the kind of principles that should shape the content of budgets. There are also principles that should shape the process of human rights-based budgeting. So these are very similar to the panel principles, and these include participation. So does civil society have opportunities to meaningfully engage in the budget process? Does the project process actively engage with marginalised groups who are least likely to have their rights realised? Does accountability? Does the budget process include sufficient oversight to ensure accountability? Transparency, so are we publishing the assessments that we're making around non-discrimination? And are we kind of making our budget in a way that reduces systemic inequalities? And transparency. Oh, sorry, I think I've already said transparency, sorry, and non-discrimination. So when we look at all of that stuff and we look at the rights that need to be realised in Scotland, this can look like a really huge ask with a huge resource requirement. And we often hear about the fact that we are existing in a time of harsh economic constraints. So how is Scotland doing on maximising our resources to put towards economic, social and cultural rights realisation? So if we think about non-discrimination, current fiscal policy often reinforces inequality. The way that Scotland prioritised taxation of income from work rather than income from wealth can disproportionately impact women and act as a kind of tax break to wealthy men. But there are ways that we can rectify that. There are also avenues to maximise resources more equitably and to raise more revenue, even under the current resource constraints, because Scotland is a wealthy country. And wealth as a kind of proportion of GDP has grown in recent years, but we are a highly unequal country. And our taxation system isn't working kind of in line with that principle of non-discrimination and working to mitigate those systemic inequalities that we see in society. So I am not alone in thinking this. So the Scottish Human Rights Commission has suggested that the Scottish Government pursue more progressive taxation strategies in order to support rights realisation. And the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, who is a kind of body that interprets international human rights law for that treaty, has called on the UK as a whole to improve tax collection and clamp down on tax avoidance, and also to introduce more progressive taxation for to support rights realisation. So we are aware that Scotland has taken a more kind of progressive strategy than England, and Poverty Alliance, we really welcome this, but there is more that could be done to kind of maximise the resources that we have as a nation to support rights realisation for all. So we published in partnership with PPR, Oxfam, One Parent Family Scotland, Wellbeing Economic Alliance as well. We published a briefing around what a more progressive taxation system could look like, and I'll share this with Olivia to share with you at the end of today. And we put forward there several avenues by which we could raise more resources to kind of support Scotland to achieve its progressive policy goals and think about how it's going to finance its future commitments under the new Human Rights Bill. So some of the suggestions that were, recommendations that were outlined in that briefing include introducing a new tax band between the higher and top rate, which could raise between 110 and 260 million pounds per year. Committing to reforming the devolved tax system. There are devolved tax levers that we are not yet using to their full kind of capability. And so as a priority, we think that that is something that needs to be committed to and actioned. A key place where wealth is held in Scotland is in housing. And we know that council tax isn't supporting the Scottish Government to address systemic inequality. So the top 10% of earners in Scotland live in houses that are council tax band A to D, so the kind of lowest paying council tax bands. So we've recommended a reform of council tax as a way to more kind of adequately tax wealth. I won't go into too much detail about the recommendations because I'll share the report with you later, but we also kind of suggest that the Scottish Government explores wealth tax more thoroughly to think about how can we address those systemic inequalities in our society and ensure that we live in a Scotland where our economic, social and cultural rights are realised for all. So I wanted to end on a little bit of a hopeful note because we are hearing a lot about our kind of dire economic circumstances, but we are a wealthy country and there are avenues to maximise the resources that we have for rights realisation in Scotland. I'm aware that that was a really heavy talk with lots of principles. And so thank you all for kind of staying with me. And yeah, thank you so much for listening today.